Dr. Mark Geier. I'm an MD, PhD. I've spent 10 years at the National Institutes of Health. I've been a professor at Johns Hopkins University and the University Uniformed Services of the University of the Health Sciences. Published almost 100 peer-reviewed articles related to mostly vaccines, but also genetics. And I've testified before the U.S. Congress, and I've testified before the Institute of Medicine on 6 occasions, and before the Department of State.
And I'm David Geier, a graduate of UMBC with a BA in biology and a minor in history. Worked at the NIH also. I'm currently a graduate student in biochemistry at the George Washington University, and I've testified before the Institute of Medicine on vaccines twice in the last year.
We are the only independent group that has been trying really hard to get in to see the VSD data, and we've done so with the support of some members of the U.S. House of Representatives, Dr. Weldon, and also Dan Burton and some others, and we've had some adventures for a number of years.
And our initial attempts to try to get access to the VSD actually predate the public announcement, which was on August 31st of 2002, where CDC said that external researchers could get access. We initially began in early August calling up CDC. It's a rather informal thing. We talked to Dr. Robert Chen, who's since been fired from CDC for his handling of the VSD, but at the time he was in charge of vaccine safety, and he said all we would need to do was file a formal written request, sign our names over it, and they would grant us full access. Well, we did that, and about 2.5, 3 weeks went by, and we got back a letter from Dr. Chen saying, it's nice that you submitted this request, but now we've opened the VSD to everybody. And he gave us a copy of the CDC's press release. And so we began a process where we filed proposals with CDC stating that we wanted to look at VSD and trying to delineate what we wanted to look at in our studies. And initially we proposed a very simple series of studies. We had published about 20 or 25 peer-reviewed studies out of the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VAERS database, analyzing vaccine safety. So we said, let's do the same thing in the VSD. And the CDC sent back, no, you can't just do the studies you did in VAERS in the VSD database. They have to be brand new proposals. So we began the process of going back and forth, and CDC kept asking us for more, what they said were clarifications to our proposals. They wanted to know our analytical methods, our statistical methods, exactly what our vaccine hypotheses were. In other words, we thought vaccines would cause a certain condition at a certain time following vaccination. And the final one that we filed in December of 2002 was over 200 pages long. So we went from something, one sheet of paper, to almost 200 pages. And then what happened in December was, on the 10th of December 2002, my father testified before Congress, and Dan Burton actually asked him in the middle of his testimony that he said, I heard you're trying to get into the VSD database. Are you in yet? And my father replied, no, and they seem to be putting us through endless hurdles. If you watch the videotape, Dan Burton actually pointed out into the audience to somebody and said, I want to see you after this hearing about that. And we think what he was talking to was one of the CDC representatives that was there. And so on December 31st, 2002, we got a letter back from CDC stating that they had approved our proposals.
And by the way, that they weren't trying to stop us from getting in, they were just trying to make the proposals better.
Yeah, the previous proposals, in their words, were designed to improve the quality of them, not to hinder our access in any way. And actually later, Dr. William Broom, who is the director of the whole National Immunization Program, wrote a letter stating that even though he had approved our proposals, he really hadn't. So they were actually later to deny they were even approved our proposals. But at that time, the next step, you might think, well, we got right into VSD. That's not what happened. We had to contact each of the health maintenance organizations that participate in VSD. For those who aren't familiar, Vaccine Safety Data Link has very different than the data than the VAERS database. VAERS involves reporting of vaccine-suspected adverse events. The VSD contains the complete medical records on patients, and it has as another file what vaccines they got, so there's no reporting involved. And we looked, and as part of that data, it comes from health maintenance organizations, primarily in California and the Pacific Northwest. So we had to contact each of those Kaisers and other HMOs and get their institutional review boards to approve our ability to see their data in the VSD.
And we had to apply to each one, and the typical application was a couple hundred pages, and they asked all kinds of interpretable questions like what kind of surgery you're going to do on our patients, how many home visits are you going to do, how many surveys you're going to do. And of course, all we wanted to do was see data that had no names, addresses, phone numbers, or even identification as to which health plan it came to. But we went through and filled out all those forms.
And this was in January, February. We started to get really peeved at CDC that they were putting us through all these hoops. So we filed a series of requests that not only did we want to analyze new data for our own studies in the VSD, we wanted to reanalyze their data from published studies.
There's a law, actually, that when the government publishes studies on which they base policy, that they have to make all the data available from those studies. And of course, as it turns out, they're not going to show anybody any of that data. They intentionally destroyed some of it, and the rest of it was lost.
We asked for a series of published studies, including the Verstraeten study, which at that time hadn't been published. And we got back very interesting responses from the CDC to our requests. They admitted, just as an example, the safety of neonatal hepatitis B vaccine. That's that birth dose of hepatitis B that everybody's so concerned about. Turns out that first CDC said that they didn't have the data, so we said, I mean, that's unacceptable. So who has it?
And then they see congressmen get on and say they had to give us the data, find out who has it.
They went and they found the person. He reported back, well, it's on obsolete media, so we can't access it.
So we said, give it to us on obsolete media. We'll find somebody that can convert it to regular, normal media. Meaning, really what they meant is it's on computer tape drives, and nowadays people use DVDs and CDs. So they went on and they said, well, it's been damaged. I mean, we have letters and everything about this. It's been damaged. So we said, good. Give it to us with the damage. We'll have it repaired. And finally they said, well, it's actually been lost. All the patient data has been lost. So the United States, by the way, we suggested at that point that they withdraw that study because there's no data to look at. And the whole U.S. policy on this issue, this controversial issue of giving children shots at birth, is based on a study that they have no data on, and they've lost the data.
And additionally, regarding the thimerosal study, the Verstraeten one, what we got was an admission that first we couldn't get it because it was under consideration for publication. And so we said, okay, well, we understand it's still a work in progress. Let's see your preliminary results. And what they responded back was that they were changing the data set in response to peer review comments.
Let me tell you something. I've done a lot of publishing. Peer reviewers sometimes ask you to change a statistical method, sometimes a discussion, sometimes references. The one thing you never change is the data. But they were changing, we have this in writing, they were changing the data.
So we followed that up again with Congress saying, okay, the final data set, you're still changing and manipulating it. Let's see the intermediate data sets where Verstraeten found all the effects of thimerosal on neurodevelopmental disorders.
Like the ones that were discussed at Simpsonwood, or the ones even before Simpsonwood.
And what they responded back was that those data sets had been destroyed.
Which is in violation of U.S. law, the data quality access laws, and the quality and open access laws have all been violated.
So we had a lot of trouble with their own studies, but on our own new studies, eventually by about June of 2003, we'd been approved by, I think it was 4 or 5 different HMOs, their IRBs. They said we could have these new data sets. And so we went back to CDC and contacted them and said, we've been approved, now can we see the VSD database? And CDC said, no, you can't. Now you have to specify to us exactly what you want in the database. And you have to understand, we were people, and this is true to this day, that nobody in the outside community has seen the VSD database. So you're doing something blind. You don't know what's in there. You've never cut with it. You never worked on it. So you don't know what would be found.
And probably nobody has more experience than we do of working with this kind of data, since we've published many, many studies on vaccines in big databases, but we had never seen that one. And they kept saying, what do you want in it? And we kept saying, what's in there? And they kept saying, we won't tell you, what do you want in it?
But finally we reached a point where we said we were satisfied it had as much as they would be willing to give us, and they were satisfied it met their stringent requirements of us specifying what should be in there. So about a week before we were scheduled to go to the research data center.
And before that we had to pay $3,200 out of our pocket in certified check for the privilege of seeing the U.S. government's data, even though we were asked by Congress to go see it. And in fact, we said, you know, this was a request of Congress, surely you will waive the fee. And they said, no, we're not going to waive the fee. We charge that to everybody. And by the way, we're the everybody. There's never been anybody else. So there is no everybody. It's a complete fabrication.
But so a week before we were scheduled to go in, CDC mentioned, of course, you're proficient in SAS. SAS, as it turns out, is a computer language, a rather primitive, archaic way of programming with data. And we had never heard of it, so we had to postpone looking at the database.
And they try to imply that anybody that knew what they were doing would do SAS. And as we started to inquire, there are a few people that know how to do SAS, but not very many. It's not a standard language. But we had to, for the first time in this 2-year odyssey, we had to ask for postponement while we were trying to get someone that would come in with us as a programmer that could do SAS. And the first thing they said was, you're only approved for the two of you, you know. You can't bring a third person. They haven't been approved by the Kaisers. And we had a big fight with Congress people on the phone, and finally they said, well, we'll let you bring a programmer if you want. In the meantime, while all this was going on, they published a paper. And the paper came out, and the paper said that the Geiers were misusing and manipulating and abusing the data in the VSD. See, they had it all figured out. This would be just timed just right. We would have been in there and they could criticize us. They didn't know we were going to ask for the postponement, but you know how the press goes. Once it goes, it goes. So they criticized our use of this database before we ever got there. And it's really embarrassing because you can document that very easily.
And in our search for a computer programmer, we were nice enough to find a parent who offered his service. His name was Vail Krenick.
And he actually spoke at this conference.
And he is a computer programmer by trade. He didn't know SAS, but he said he could go out in a couple of weeks and learn how to use it. And so he took it upon himself.
You understand it takes 2 years, but he's a brilliant guy, and he helped IBM develop these things. So he thought he could learn in 2 weeks what usually takes 2 years to learn.
And he, after about 2 or 3 weeks, said he was proficiently capable to be able to do searches in the VSD database, the language. And so we called CDC back up, and we arranged for in October 2 days to look at the VSD database. And when we did that, we went down to the Research Data Center with Vail, who flew in, and what we found is it's located in this place called Research Data Facility, which is in part of the National Center for Health Statistics, which is in Hyattsville, Maryland. And we went to this building, nondescript brick building, didn't even have a sign saying it was the Research Data Center. And we went in there, and it's got armed guards at the door. They search everybody that goes in. They won't even let you enter the building until the monitor comes down. CDC had employed a monitor to watch every single keystroke, everything that we did in the VSD database, and to keep a complete record of it.
Like we're Iraqi criminals or something. And they had a right to record every single key step that we did. We were not allowed any cell phones, any tape recorders, anything that we could write anything down on. And every time we wanted a printout, the printer was in a room 3 doors down. They got to we would order the print. They disabled all the drives of the computer, so we couldn't do anything internally. We'd order the print, and then our monitor was supposed to go get the printout. And first of all, she didn't have the key, so she had to go get someone else to get the key. And then our monitor had the right to look at the printout and white out anything they didn't like, basically. Any results, less than 5 results, like if you said how many people had such and such and it was 4, they could white that out. In fact, they decided they could white out the whole page if there was a 4 on there, because the rules are if there's less than 5, after all, you could figure out who it was. I have no idea how you could figure out who it was, since there's no names, addresses, phone numbers, or even what HMO they're with. In addition, as we pointed out through Congress, the Verstatten study, which supposedly had the same rules, had 18 places where they had less than 5, and theirs weren't whited out. And our Congress people were told there are 2 sets of rules. External researchers can't, they can.
But that's sort of ahead of the story. When we initially went there, we went up with the monitor and we sat down at the computer, and to give you an idea of SAS, for those who aren't familiar, the way in which they gave it to us, it's like the old DOS, if you ran that on your IBM, where you get simply a C:, and they said type away. Well, Vail Krenick said he had been using the most up-to-date version of SAS, which is what they promised to give us.
And that had things like icons, things that would help you, like more like a Windows system where you point to something, you make it happen. And they had promised to give us that. But when we get there, they don't have it. And they started calling around and they said, yes, they have it at CDC, and no, you can't have it, haha. That's what you get. This is what you get.
The monitor actually called them up, on CDC, on the line and told them that that was true. And they said it was too bad. If you're not proficient enough to be able to do it, without that, you can't access this data. So Vail began to program without that.
And they closed the door, and the monitor who was supposed to watch us said, now I'm only going to watch you, and I'm going to watch every move you make. And she said, now, she took off her jacket. She says, now, I have an affected child, and I'm going to make sure you see what you're supposed to see. And you're going to not leave here till you find out what we already know, which is that there's an effect. And I'm not supposed to help you, now I'm going to help you.
And over the course of 2 days, what we were able to do was to replicate what we had done in the VAERS. Look at children getting thimerosal containing DTaP versus thimerosal free DTaP.
And they were sure this couldn't happen, and it couldn't happen. Even if you were the world's expert on that system, you could never have done it unless you had a PhD biostatistician who spends full time working on the system on that particular database. But we did have such a person. It was their own monitor.
So we felt very confident that there was an effect there. Vail actually personally was very suspicious that thimerosal was doing anything. He was doing all kinds of other biomedical interventions with his child. But after looking at that, he became seriously suspect that thimerosal seemed to really be doing something. And so we, over the next course of months, CDC...
Well, before you do that, well, the last thing is that we also had the data sets that they were supposed to show us on their studies. And we were actually, we had 13 data sets of our own. We were only working on one. We were comparing children that had DTaP with and without thimerosal. And the monitor kept saying, but I want you to look at their data sets. And we said, we're busy, we're working on this, Well, toward the end of the second day, she says, I'm turning off your computer, you're going to look at it, whether you like it or not. So we looked at it, and what she wanted us to see was they had sent us absolutely worthless stuff, and she was so embarrassed about it. There's no data that anybody on this planet could have used in their stuff, even though they promised to give us the original data. All they gave us was a coded form of basically the output that was in the publication, the final chart. We wanted to see the data, how they put it together. They supplied none of it, and she wanted us to see that.
And we should mention too about how they made our data sets. Mentioned we're looking at DTaP vaccine. What they had done was take each of our vaccine proposals, and we had asked for 13 different vaccine types. They had taken those and split them into separate data sets. The VSD is supposed to be a relational database, meaning if you have one piece of information on a patient in one field and you look in another one, you should be able to link them together. But they had scrambled the numbers.
The linkers.
The linkers.
And our proposal specifically said we were going to compare one vaccine type to another. If you read our papers and theirs, that's our technique. They admit that they said that, but they're not going to give it to us. They're going to give it to us in separate pieces, and the links have been scrambled.
But despite all of this, as I said, we were still happy because we got something out and it looked like it was confirming what we were seeing in VAERS. Our second access session was in the end of January, right before the February 2004 IOM hearing occurred. And we went in, and this second time, CDC hired 2 monitors instead of 1. They hired a monitor for the monitor.
Because it had occurred to them that their monitor must have helped us.
And
they weren't going to have that happen again.
And this time when it happened is when we began to get these printouts that were completely whited out. We print out a table that was full of data, and what they decided to do was if they had one piece of data that they claimed we couldn't have access to, they would obliterate all the other data in the table.
And we couldn't even know that because until you see the printout, you don't know whether it's going to come out less than 5 or not.
And I got so upset when I was there. I almost got in a fist fight with the guy. I started shouting at him, we're paying $1,000 a day to be here. Vail Krenick again flew in all the way from Texas, and you're not allowing us to see any of the data. And I said that you'd promised to Congressman Weldon and his staff on the phone that we would have open access to this. And so I stormed out and called up Congressman Weldon's office.
And you had to go out because you can't use your cell phone inside the building because it's all secret stuff,
And then what I told that office was that they're denying us access to the data. And Congressman Weldon's staff said, they'd come down. We were only about 35, 40 minutes away from the Capitol in Hyattsville. And CDC responded back by saying that they weren't going to be allowed into the building.
They would not allow a sitting U.S. House of Representative doctor who's on the Oversight Committee, whose job it is to watch this, would not be allowed in the building. Because after all, he hadn't been approved by the Kaisers, Or the other HMOs?
So we ended up getting nothing out in our second access session. And we went to the February 9th IOM in 2004 in sort of good spirits. At least we had something to look at. We could present that VSD seemed to be confirming theirs, that the more thimerosal children got, the more risk they had of neurodevelopmental disorders. And before we presented, Dr. Robert Davis got up and made an announcement. In addition to his usual presentation about the Verstraeten study, he announced that external researchers were looking at the VSD database and that they had found an effect, but when he did a series of modifications to it that are very unclear exactly what he did, he was able to make the effect disappear.
And we got up and we were very angry. First of all, we knew his modifications were wrong because he was correcting for age like 2 months of age. And the way we had done the study is you had to have had 4 shots, and you have to be 18 months old to have 4 shots, so they can't be any 2 months old. So we were very angry that he was misleading the people. But we were just anxious to go back and prove him wrong.
We both sides had a smile. When Bob
Yeah.
Davis got off, he had a smile. We'd disproven the Geiers, and we had a smile because we were going to go back to VSD and disprove him. Well, Bob Davis had the real chuckle, as it turns out, because within 1 week of that IOM hearing, we started to get in the mail letters from the Kaisers that approved us, stating that the CDC had alleged that we were trying to violate patient confidentiality.
Or we might be doing that, and we might be doing illegal studies. So they were withdrawing our access. And we later found out that not only that, but the day that we left, our data sets were destroyed, even though we had an agreement that they would keep the data sets. And that was, we found that out because the second monitor testified under oath at the IOM meeting, and he said that he was instructed the minute we left to destroy those data sets, which is incidentally long before the Kaisers ever withdrew our access.
So this was what it looks like is a contrived effort on the part of CDC, that they went into our computer programs, they went into our logs, saw that we were seeing the effect, and they terminated those data sets.
And incidentally, those logs, the agreement was, although they could keep all the logs and every keystroke we made, they could only look at them for patient confidentiality. They could not look at how we analyzed it, nor could they reanalyze it. But obviously, they didn't obey their own rules.
And so we began down the long road of trying to appeal these sort of revoking of our ability to see the VSD data. And what we eventually found out was, and CDC didn't even send us this letter, that they had sent out a letter making these accusations. And we finally got a hold of it, and so we were actually finally able to make a response. I mean, initially we just got a letter from Kaiser saying, you've been accused of these things by CDC, we suspend you. We didn't even know what the specific document from CDC was.
And they're implying that we could breach patient confidentiality. First of all, there's no names, addresses, phone numbers, or any identifying material. Secondly, I missed something in this. I was playing tennis in Florida, and I was asked by Congress to investigate them. If the names, addresses, and phone numbers were there, as they often are in my practice and in my other databases that I use, where do they come off implying that I would want to steal them? First of all, what would I do with them? Secondly, I'm the investigatee, not the I'm the investigator, not the investigatee. How dare they imply that those crooks are worried that I'm a crook? When did I become a crook? I was asked to go look. And besides which, you couldn't tell. And we told the Kaisers and showed them that there is no names, addresses. By the way, the Kaisers didn't know that. They had supplied the CDC with full names and addresses. They didn't know that they had been stripped out for a public database. So, of course, they started giving us permission to go back in again.
It took us from about February, when the letter came, through about, I'd say, September, October, to finally get reapproved by several different HMOs that had suspended our access, so we could look at their data in the VSD again. And by that time, the National Immunization Program, who had been in charge of allowing external researchers to look at the data, had already had that power stripped away.
They were been fired, and we need to tell you about that because it's totally involved with this. After the 2004 IOM, at which they tried to embarrass us and which numerous scientists on our side presented from major universities that there were problems, the 2004 IOM, as people are probably aware, concluded that there was no possible link between thimerosal and neurodevelopmental disorders and autism. And not only that, no further research should be done. Never heard a scientific recommendation like that. And we've seen lots of internal documents that they decided this long before they ever had the hearings, and we also know that it was paid for by the CDC, and there's all kinds of illegal things going on about it. And in fact, Dr. Weldon opened the meeting by telling that we know this meeting's phony, we know what you're going to do, and we're going to tell you before, and that's all on the record. But even that, forget about that. It turns out that there was another IOM that was held that summer, and that IOM was to
This
look
is
into...
in the summer of 2005. I mean 2004, sorry.
This was to look into problems with data access, and I think they thought they were going to get the IOM to say that people like us shouldn't be looking at the VSD database, and that intermediate studies like the ones we had found from Verstatten were not fair game. Their memos don't mean anything. Nobody should look at people's internal memos. But that's not what happened. They came out with this report in February of 2005, and it's entitled Vaccine Safety Research, Data Access, and Public Trust. And this IOM report basically says that the data that was analyzed by the 2004 report, and obviously they chose to only believe the government's data and not the other data, but this report says the government's data was manipulated, that they withheld data, that they did things inappropriately, they changed their criteria inappropriately, and it recommended that there be two outside panels be set up. One is to assure that outside researchers can get to see all the data they want, and the other one was to see that when they do their own internal studies, they do them fairly and that they don't change their criteria and all that kind of stuff. So this one totally trumps the other one. And one day after this came out, exactly one day, this came out on a Thursday in February, one day after that, there was a meeting to which Julie Gabardine was invited. She's the head of CDC. And at that meeting, the entire vaccine immunization program was fired. And I mean fired. They may try to put a spin on it and say reorganized. But the head of that program, Dr. Robert Chen, no longer is a chief, and he no longer works on childhood vaccines. And beyond that, the National Immunization Program of the CDC that had been in charge of vaccine safety for over 30 years is no longer any authority on vaccine safety at all. So when they run around telling you to take the vaccine, they still have authority for vaccine uptake. But everybody needs to stop them and say, by the way, you're not in charge of safety anymore, are you? Because they were completely fired from that. And Julie Gabardine said her own office, she would supervise the safety. And no disrespect, but I don't think she's able to supervise the safety, but that's